and welcome to another episode of 50 Shades and Grey, where I'm joined by one very special guest of mine, which is my brother. Hello, mate. Welcome. How are you doing?
Good. I'm all right, thanks.
So the reason why I've got my brother on here today is not that we're just keeping it in the family. I thought it'd be a really interesting viewpoint to have. He lives in New York. He's been out there, what, you've been 38 years now?
33.
33 years. So,
Yeah.
and we both went out together back in 1990, where we travelled out to Colorado for work. And then I went to university and you came to New York with me, didn't you? You always planned to go there. So I went to New York. I went to Connecticut. I was playing football out there, so I was there for a couple of years. My brother went down to New York, and then hasn't returned home since, really. So you've been there the whole time. You've had no spells back coming home.
No, none.
So basically, my brother's got married, and their situation. Which is more commonplace now, I think, but at the time wasn't so. So his wife has been a career woman. My brother's career allowed him to work at home, so it made sense to them both that he would raise the children as the house husband, if you like, and his wife then continued her career at work. So pretty much the opposite to how everything else works. I'm right so far, right?
Yes.
So the reason why I wanted to speak to you today, mate, was because I know it's something that we've spoke about on this podcast a couple of times. It's come up, but I thought it'd be really good to get a male perspective because you've raised the kids sort of right the way through from school, obviously, and done everything that most people do. How as a male have you found that experience?
I mean, multitudes, really. I guess a big part of it has been it's just eye-opening to many, many facets of relationships and also to raising children. I think the cliche or the understanding that women raise children because, generally speaking, because it's somehow natural and because they have breasts. My experience, when my son was born, my kids are in their 20s now, but when my son was born and we made this decision that one of us would stay at home, I really didn't know how I was going to feel about it. I didn't even know how I was going to feel about having kids. I suppose a lot of us don't. And to my great surprise and happiness, I found that I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And it's a great privilege to be able to do that. But to answer your question, it was really kind of, on occasionally quite shocking, the reaction I would get. And always from men, never from women. The negative reaction from men was really kind of upsetting sometimes. And then obviously you get used to it and whatnot. But there was a sense from a lot of men that I ran into that I didn't know very well usually, that if a man stays at home, he has somehow failed in a career, or he stayed home because he's useless in a sense, because that's all he can do. That is good enough. I think there's this misunderstanding about stay-at-home dads that we're all from Brooklyn and we all sit around talking about solar panels, and giving our kids mashed yeast and and it just isn't like that at all. It's a very practical, hands-on job, as most people know that have kids, and it's very demanding. It's incredibly stressful, and when it's you doing most of it, because in the early days my wife traveled a lot, and we were living outside of New York at the time in a town where we didn't know anyone. We had no social life. We literally had no friends. And I think you came over once or twice, maybe once or twice, and it was a very difficult time. And I was there always with the kids. And when you have two young kids by yourself, day after day after day, it's a lot. It's more than a job. It's just continual emotional pressure. Um, yeah. So in terms of what I learned, I mean, I think everybody's experience is different because all kids are very different. Yet they have different reactions. The way they interact with each other is different. Their friends are different. But there's only so much you can influence, because you have to remind yourself that no matter how well you think you're raising your kids. I mean, I knew a mother who, when the kid was 2, she refused to allow her to use the word gun. Like, you can get some absurdities like that. But eventually, your kids are going to hang out with other kids. And they are going to eat chicken nuggets. And they are going to swear. And they are going to smoke weed. And they are going to do stupid stuff, you know. And I think that sorry, I'm branching off a bit here, but the sense of when they're young that you're going to have these perfect children, and they're going to be on this kind of train track and stay the same way their whole lives, is completely wrong, completely misguided. And I think I just answered 5 questions there.
I think
Even 4 of them you didn't ask.
I think one of the main things, and we are generalising slightly because it's not the same situation for everybody, but a lot of men probably who are going out to work and walking out the door every day at 7 o'clock, coming back through the door at 6:30, and they are, you know, busting their backsides in order to make a living for the family. I don't think have the appreciation of what the job that most women do, and more men these days, but I don't think they have the appreciation of how hard the actual job is, because it is full time, isn't it?
Yeah, and I wouldn't even say it's the appreciation. I think when the kids are young, the spouse generally more respects the stay-at-home parent, because the responsibilities are 24/7. As they get older, they go to high school and what, they're 14, 15, the responsibilities become less and less. But then the emotional responsibility becomes more. When they're babies, you're worried about their health, and you're worried about getting them vaccinated, and they get sick all the time and all this kind of thing. But I think what it is with the spouse, men in particular, it's a lack of comprehension as to what it is you're doing for your family. And it's that one of the main things you're doing is you're allowing your spouse to concentrate 100% on their job and nothing else. And granted, when the spouse comes home, the spouse will help out and take the kids for a while, and you'll take a break and all the rest of it. But that spouse doesn't have to think about the kids during the day. He doesn't have to worry about them. He or she can come home and know that everything's taken care of. I mean, you know, when my wife used to come out sometimes, the house was a disaster. You know, it was. But that speaks more about me generally, rather than it does my kids. You know, those early years are extremely stressful for all concerned. But like I said, I think most men in particular, they lack the comprehension about what it is you're doing, the profound importance of what you're doing. And then, typically speaking, once the kids go off to college, if they do go to college, then it's like, okay, now what are you going to do?
So
yeah.
So that was the next bit that I wanted to get you onto, because that was sort of the bulk of what I wanted to talk about today. Because so after you've invested all of this time and you've worried about them sort of as babies, and then you worry about them after school, then you worry about where they're going, then they get to that age where you're always needed. I know that, but you're not at the forefront of everything anymore. So what was that?
No.
What was that like for you? I mean, it's called sort of empty nest syndrome. But what
Right.
did you sort of go through that? How was that from your point of view?
I mean, for most parents, American parents, when the day that your kids go off to college and you drop them off is one of the most emotional days you'll ever have. Um, because they have, as as the cliche goes, they've flown the nest. But I think most people that stay home, as far at least in New York, they kind of had a backup plan, myself included, for when the kids do leave, and and you hope to have a kind of career which you would have started on years and years ago. And I have some friends that did this when their kids went to high school. They, took a real estate license, for example, so that it would take a few years to get that going. And for me, my career, as it was writing, and I've written since the 90s. And my plan, such as it was to write throughout every day when the kids were at school, which I did. And by the time they went off to college, I would have my career set up and running, and it didn't happen. I wasn't successful. And even though I'm still writing, I'm still not successful. And, I'm well into my 30s. So it's I'll give it another 20 years, but I think that's about it. Um, and that's enormously humiliating and depressing in a way, because your plan failed. And apart from football coaching, which I've done as long as you've done, I had no other qualifications. And football coaching, as you know, pays peanuts. And to make a career out of that is extremely hard. And I would have had to start that in the 90s probably, but I wasn't interested in a career in that.
Did you? But was there a sort of a sense of now, like almost like a hole in your life once the kids had gone? Did you?
Oh yeah, sorry, you asked me about that. Yeah, yeah, definitely. There was, my daughter moved to a different town and a different city in the States, and I miss her more than I ever have. It's obviously the feelings don't go away, even though once your kids are grown, they speak to you like an adult, which is a bit odd at first, and they make fun of you, like in a really kind of sophisticated way, which is odd at first, and they say things to you that you had said to them when they were kids to sort of chastise you. That was the funny thing. But there was a sense that my job is done when the kids went off to college. And even though I would visit them a lot, well, we both would visit them a lot rather. There was a big hole, and my writing was supposed to take that hole, or take that place of them, and it didn't work, unfortunately, which is not uncommon for writers not to be successful. But I had been at it a very long time, so for nothing to have happened, apart from coming close on a few occasions, was as difficult for me as the kids leaving.
Did you feel less pressure when on sort of you having a career when you was looking after the kids as such, because you was already doing a job and your writing was almost like a second job, if you like? So once the kids had gone, did you feel like that was your primary career and that put more pressure on it?
I did, and I don't want to talk about writing too much because it's not really that relevant to for your viewers. But any sort of artistic pursuit, if you want to say that, is an extremely low percentage of success. Whether you're an actor, a writer, or a painter, whatever, there's an extremely high failure rate in that. But the irony was, I had actually come closest to having something produced when I was busiest with the kids, around about 2014. So them leaving obviously gave me more time, but I had always found the time to do it. And I was just left with this kind of sense of, well, shit, now what? I
Yeah.
guess I'll coach more kids. I don't know.
Because I was reading the other day that, and obviously through the questions that I get and the comments that I get through Instagram and through YouTube as well, is that when this happens to a lot of women in their 40s, that's a prominent time of where they can then start looking at their own relationships and realizing that themselves and their partners have gone in completely different directions, because one's been so busy working and the other one's been just taking care of the kids. And then once the kids have gone, they're then sort of there together thinking, right, we either get to know each other again, or by that stage, they're very different people. Have you found that happens a lot sort of in the States or not?
I know that it's true that a lot of couples do separate after the kids go off, to college, sometimes high school, whatever, because there is, because all you're talking about when you're raising your kids is your kids. Even when you're not with your kids, you're talking about your kids. And then suddenly you are no longer talking about the kids as much, but you're kind of reestablishing, as you said, that relationship when it was just the two of you, which was a very long time ago. So personally, that didn't happen, no. But I can see how that would be really difficult for people, to come to terms with that. And you turn around and say, shit, who's this? What a fucking arsehole. I was too busy to notice. I'm sure that happens, yeah.
So when you hear sort of like you get a lot of sort of classic stories of, and I've had conversations, with guys that I know that are going through divorces, and they're like, my wife's taking half of everything I've earned, and she's got the kids, and I've still got to pay. Mate, does it to give you any more sympathy towards the sort of the stay-at-home husband wife in those circumstances than maybe you had previously before?
I think it goes back to the lack of comprehension as to what the stay-at-home parent is doing and has done. And it's not as if there should be endless gratitude until they're dead. You don't want the spouse to be thanking you profusely, because after all, the best kids are raised by two parents anyway. They're not just
Yeah.
raised by one. Well, that came out wrong. It's not that single parenting is bad or anything, but it's much easier to do it with two parents that really care. It's much, much easier. But when you think about when you have parents who both have careers and they choose to stay at work and continue their careers, oftentimes they'll hire the cheapest nanny they can get. And I remember I had a friend who was working and his wife was working, and they were so excited because they got this nanny who was cheaper than anybody else they'd interviewed, and they just hired her. So it's like as if that's the kind of focus, It just seems crazy to me. I used to take the kids to the park all the time, of course, like most parents do after school. And it would be me and a couple of mums and like 100 nannies. Because New York City is very career orientated and the rest of it. But, most of the nannies are sitting there on the phone. The kids are like falling off the slides and going the wrong way up the swing. And, and the nannies are just sitting there like gossiping. And I'm like 3 inches behind my kids at all times. And, just paying attention. And I think the thought process behind having children has changed. First of all, because we're having children a lot later than our parents did.
Yeah.
That's a very important thing to take into account. So if we're not wiser, we have a lot more experience than our parents did. But I think also the attitude towards kids now is very focused on the kids. And for our parents, it wasn't. Kids were like just a matter of course, something you had. like a fridge, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
or something you did once you got married, have a bunch of kids. It's very different for us, you know, because also when you're older, you typically are a bit better off financially than you would have been at, say, 21, 22. And it's easier in that sense. But I think we put a lot more focus on our kids' welfare than our parents did. And that's a good thing, of course. The lack of comprehension, if I get back to that for a minute, is not to say that the spouse who's working doesn't care to understand. But I think from my perspective, I changed completely with the kids. It changed my worldview. You know, I was suddenly more compassionate, suddenly interested in other people's kids, which I never even noticed that other people had kids before. Um, and, you know, it was just small things like I'd wake up if somebody breathed wrong. Because when you're doing the feeding during the night, if you remember those days, you're listening for your son or your daughter to wake up, and you leap out of bed and, you know, you feed them and change the nappy and all that. But still to this day, I really like sleeping before the kids. I sleep through a hurricane. Like, my sleep is terrible because the slightest thing wakes me up. The dog moves and I wake up. It changed me as a person. Having the kids, you develop a love that you've never experienced in your life. And that, I think, changes your whole perspective on the world.
Yeah.
That does sound a bit grandiose, doesn't it?
No, I agree with you. I know that feeling of, you know, when I had Zach, it was that feeling of experiencing a completely unconditional love. And then for me, it changed my view of relationships as well, because I wanted it to get, once you know that you can love something that much, you kind of want to get as close. For me, I wanted to get as close as I could to that with someone else. But that's very
Yeah,
hard to replicate outside of your kids.
it is. I mean, we had our second, we had our daughter quite soon after our son, because we just loved having a son and we just wanted more. Really, that was it. So they kind of followed on the heels of each other. And a part of me wishes I had started much younger. But then the other part is saying, well, you know, we had two healthy kids and you can't wish for too much. You know, thank God.
So in terms of, like, you've been married now, you've been married over 30 years?
70, 20, Sam minus one, 23.
23. So if you could give people a
23 years.
couple, like, because I've asked a couple of the guys this before that I've had on, like, from a male point of view, what would be your couple of keys that you would say to a successful long relationship?
I think all relationships are totally different. I mean, obviously they're totally different. Sorry, that's a stupid thing to say. But I think they're as different as your kids. And I think just, you know, you have to respect each other. You have to respect the person's failings as well as their successes, and not to try to force your perspective on that person, or to force your ideas on that person if they think quite differently about things. One person's very untidy, the other person's very clean, for example. But at some point, you got to have some sort of leeway. You can't expect one person to go from one extreme to the other at all, really.
Mm.
There has to be compromise. These are basic things. Compromise is a basic thing, of course. I mean, to be honest with you, because the kids are so important, the years just fly. And then you turn around one day and they are, you know, and it's very difficult to say what is the one or what are the one or two things that make a successful marriage. But I really think the most important thing is to respect each other's differences. I think that's the most important thing, you know.
And
It's like
lastly,
you and I, we're you know, you and I are very different people in many ways, you know, and our other brother's different in his own way.
yeah, I mean,
But
I think that what's interesting about there are three of us for people watching. So I have two brothers, and so do you.
I do
But
too.
um, do you think how your own upbringing has a big influence on how you raise your kids? So for us, for instance, we lost our dad really early. So we had a single parent. We was brought up by a single parent. But do you think things of your experience growing up have a big influence on then how you parent your own kids?
Yeah, 100%. 100%. Um, our childhood was pretty, I wouldn't say it was rough, but it could be pretty ropey at times. And I think I was very, very keen to be really attentive to my kids, to be really involved in their lives. And I did that from a very early age. Once they started school, I used to work at the school during what do you call it, playtime? I don't know what you
Yeah,
call it anymore. It's called recess here. So I'd
recess.
work at the
Yeah,
school. I was involved. You know, I put on talent show. I ran my kids' football teams, both my daughters and my sons, and coached them. And I did everything I could to spend more time with them in each day. And I think a part of that as well was because our dad died. He was only 38, and I was very conscious that I wanted the years that we have together. If I was going to go out about the same time, not to be too sort of morbid, then I wanted them to have memories of me being around all the time.
yeah,
And it doesn't mean that you spoil them, but just that you're there. You're just always there. You're there when they come home. You know, that's a really important thing. A psychotherapist told me once. You know, with regard to kids, you know, if the kids are having a tough time, there's not a lot you can do, but you can be there, and that's it. You know. So
so
yeah, our childhood was not the template for you know that anyone probably would want to follow. Um, you know, having a mum being the only parent, and of course we were living with our grandmother as well. Um, yeah, I didn't want my kids to have anything like that, like how
yeah.
I had growing up.
So last question, mate, because we're running out of time. So if you could be like grow up again, would you rather grow up in the time that you did, which was predominantly the 70s, I guess, really for your childhood, wasn't it? Or grow up
Predominantly, yeah.
predominantly, or grow up now, have that time now?
No, I'd hate to grow up now. I would hate it.
Really?
It's awful. Oh yeah, the world's horrible now. I mean, it was horrible then, but we didn't know. We didn't know it was horrible. We didn't have computers. We had no idea what was going on in France. And now you can find out what's going on all over the world. It's terrible. It's a terrible time to grow up. I feel sorry for kids growing up now. I think it was obviously, you know, every time was always more innocent. You know, it was always better when somebody else grew up, when our parents grew up, our grandparents grew up. But I think we were very fortunate in the era where we grew up was, you know, and a lot of that is down to genetics and accident of birth and where you grow up and all the rest of it. But, you know, in spite of the fact we really didn't have a lot as kids, it was a pretty decent time to be a kid, I thought.
Yeah.
And you had a lot more freedom. You know, there weren't like rapists in every corner. I mean, flashes. I saw a flasher in the forest once. I don't know if I ever told you this. There was a forest behind our house, and there was a flasher on the loose. This was like the mid-70s, and I came in and I went into the forest, which is always very dark. It's just Hainault Forest, and I heard this, psst, and I turned around as a fellow there with like the quintessential long coat, and he flashed me, and I kind of was a bit confused. I thought, what, does he want to tell me something? I didn't know what he was doing. And I thought, because I was like 9 years old, and I thought, oh, that must be the flasher. That's what he does. I didn't know what a flasher was. So anyway, so I ran in, and my mum was in the kitchen. I said, Mum, I think I just saw the flasher. And she said, oh, just ignore him. Don't call the police. Don't go see if you're still there. Don't send the neighbour after him. Just ignore him. He'll go away.
But that
Yeah.
was sort of that time, though, wasn't it? I think of so many things. I think.
Yeah. That was that time.
It was funny actually, because I was talking to. I did a podcast a couple of weeks ago about menopause, which is really great. If you haven't seen it, go on there and watch that. But when I was speaking to when I was speaking to Mum about it, she kind of said that she didn't have a menopause at all. She said because she was B2 or something like that, but she said she didn't experience any symptoms at all. But actually, when I spoke to Kate, it was who I did the podcast with, she said a lot of women at that time, because it was just a kind of an era of like, just get on with it. It was all the symptoms that they had, they sort of just got on with it. So there wasn't that understanding of what it is and what effects it has on you. And then she said when she did it with her mum and looked back, that was a time when she then got divorced from her husband and all these other things happened. So I think it was an era of where, like you say, people just ignore it, just get on with it. And I think that was the way for a lot of things and subjects.
Yeah, everything in that period was swept under the rug. Everything, but especially emotions.
Yeah.
Nobody was allowed to show any emotions. And this probably goes back to the war, because if you think, not to go too much into it, but there were a lot of people, tons of people, thousands and thousands that had either fought in the war or lived through it, that were only in their 50s, our age now. And their experiences really, really shaped him, going without all the time. And you didn't tattle on your neighbour, and you didn't ask him any personal questions either. And our schools were like that as well.
Yeah.
You know, and it was a very private time. And I think the access of the internet, along with other things, really, really changed that. So that we're able to read about everybody's slightest inclination, everybody's feelings all the time, is on every tabloid, on every laptop. And it's sort of desensitized a bit, you know, whereas in the period when we grew up, like, you didn't know anything about anybody. You're like, geez, I didn't know he was a murderer. Oh, yeah. He murdered several people. He's been in prison now, you know. He's such a nice milkman. You know, that was different. I think also, just on a very sort of superficial note, the music that we grew up with, that period, was the absolute best. The absolute best for a teenager to grow up in the 70s and 80s. That was the best music, I think.
Well, listen, Bud, I did just thank you for coming on. I hope you found it for yourself. I hope you've enjoyed it. For you guys watching, I hope it's been interesting just to hear a male point of view on what is a very female-based sort of area, usually of motherhood. Listening to someone from a male side, giving their perspective on it. So, hope you've all enjoyed it. Thanks for coming on, Bud. And don't forget, subscribe below and let me know your comments. And we'll see you soon on 50 Shades and Grey.